He was educated at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro and the slightly less exotic Monash University in Melbourne. He was formerly a Associate Dean of Research and Director of Postgraduate Studies at the School of Law at Murdoch University. He now serves as a Commissioner with the Law Reform Commission of Western Australia and is a Senior Lecturer at Murdoch University, and is also a prolific writer on a range of subjects. His subject today is the unconstitutionality of outlawing political opinion. Please welcome Dr. Augusto Zimmermann.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. And this is an important event, especially in Western Australia, because we have a right to be rebellious in our history. We had a secession movement a couple of decades ago, and that's a good sign that we are not entirely happy with what the central government does. And I think there is now new reasons as to why we should be very unhappy with what Canberra is doing. And one of the things that I believe to be quite problematic is actually the further restrictions of freedom of speech. There are various kinds of restrictions of freedom of speech, especially if you hold conservative views in this country. And the offense of these conservative people is exercising and trying to protect their conscience by refusing to agree with something they consider to be morally objectionable. Because of such laws, anti-discrimination laws, however, citizens have been penalized for expressing their political opinions or attempting to share their personal beliefs with others. For example, they have been unfairly penalized for expressing moral values, such as supporting the traditional definition of marriage, for instance. You can ask this to my friend, Archbishop Porteus in Tasmania. He's going to be able to testify to the fact. Almost uniformly, these provisions amount to a wrongful restriction of freedom of speech. For the last 20 years or so, these laws no doubt have contributed to a remarkable muzzling of conservative moral and political values. The dirty little secret is that these laws have very little to do with stamping out unreasonable discrimination or with reducing the number of murders or bigotry in this country. Far from this, such laws were enacted to suppress conservative views, as well as to give undue privilege to selected constituencies which are more valuable than others in the eyes of the law. This is why it's possible to sustain that the existing anti-discrimination laws are morally wrong. These legal instruments not only violate, better saying, free speech, but they constitute a gross violation of the implied freedom of political communication. If this freedom of political communication, which has been acknowledged by the High Court, does not protect public speech that other people may find objectionable or offensive, then it's not freedom at all. As mentioned many times in my articles, I have constantly referred to Section 18C, and Joshua is here. He's the lead author of my book, No Offense Intended. We need to send a copy of this book to the Attorney General because I don't think he's aware of the fact that 18C is indeed unconstitutional, in my opinion, and Joshua and I and Lorraine, we developed on this team. But under Section 18C, it's unlawful for a person to do an act other than in private if the act is visibly likely, in all the circumstances, to offend, insult, humiliate, or intimidate a person, where the act is done because of the race, color, or national or ethnic origin of the person. By the way, someone here, I think it was Ben, or I don't remember now, said that Professor Triggs was a bit unhappy with the fact that we cannot say certain things on the kitchen table, that we still can say that this is not a problem. I think that she doesn't know the current laws in Western Australia saying that verbal abuse can lead you to lose property as a result of the extension of domestic violence laws in this country, especially in Western Australia. The concept of domestic violence includes verbal abuse and banking and financial and you name it. So I know of people who have lost property rights and lost access to their kids as a result of saying something on the kitchen table. So it's actually happening here in Australia. So it's not something that's not occurring. And I can explain this later if you want to know more about my stories about this, because I was a commissioner in charge of reviewing this legislation. But on the 30th of March 2017, the Senate rejected proposed changes to this Section 18C. The changes were not good enough, but that tells you a lot about the fact that not even when the mild changes are to be made, the senators would necessarily agree with the proposed changes. The changes that were now passed in the Senate are not good enough. There will be some changes, procedural changes, but Section 18C is not changed, is not amended, it's not repealed, as I think it should. I think Attorney General Brandeis once stated notoriously, in my opinion, that Section 18C should be amended because people have the right to be bigots. He said, people do have a right to be bigots, you know. Well, I didn't know about that. If he wants to exercise this right, that's his problem, but I'm not thinking that this is actually about bigotry at all. It's actually very unwise, and I would say quite appalling to make such a statement. It's actually revealing a lack of understanding of the subject. I don't think the QUT students were bigots. Actually, were complaining about what they thought to be discrimination. I think the Attorney General is not aware of the content of the law. First of all, Brandeis should know that the matter has nothing to do with protecting bigots. Instead, the vast majority of supporters of the repeal of 18C are not condoning bigotry at all or promoting any such a behavior. Nor do they fail to acknowledge the enormous harm that racial vilification causes to both individuals, individual victims, and the broader community. Quite to the contrary. There are many good reasons to recommend the repeal of Section 18C, and a complete analysis of the constitutional validity of the provision is found in Joshua's and mine and Lorraine's book. I strongly recommend the Attorney General to read my book. It's called No Offense Intended, Why 18C is Wrong. Perhaps you can learn a little bit more about constitutional law. First of all, our Attorney General should know better that there are serious doubts as to whether 18C would survive a constitutional challenge in its present form. In our view, the low threshold set by the inclusion of the words offend, insult, humiliate, raises real questions as to whether this section would be supported by the Australian Constitution. Why is it so hard? I ask our political class, our political elite, why is that so hard for you to protect freedom of speech? Do you really believe in free speech at all? It doesn't seem to be so. So one thing is for sure, Section 18C cannot be supported by the external affairs power of the Australian Constitution. Under the conformity requirement, federal legislation must be reasonably capable of being considered appropriate and adapted to implementing the relevant treaty implementation or treaty provision. We find that Section 18C is not reasonably capable of being considered appropriate and adapted to implement either the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Actually, quite to the contrary, the UN Human Rights Commission has actually referred to the fact that we should have a right to freedom of expression. So if they were to protect or to uphold international law, they would actually have to do the other way around, that is to guarantee freedom of expression. If this was not problematic enough, Section 18C infringes the implied freedom of political communication concerning political and governmental matters. I mean, I know that some people here would have a problem with this, but I actually believe it's a necessary thing so that we do not replace our democracy with something that we could call an elected dictatorship, I think we are the sovereign people of this country. And in many ways, if the politicians, you know that the parliament sometimes, the debates in parliament are not very polite, and they can use some very strong words. If these people are elected by me and by you, by the citizens of this country, why is that we have no right to exercise free speech and they can exercise their free speech if we are the sovereign people? So basically what I say is that we should be able to discuss political matters freely and comfortably. The fact that our federal politicians can display such a blatant disregard for constitutional matters should be a cause of great concern. They should know better that the Australian Constitution is very clear that the government is representing us. We have a representative government. Above all, it's important not to lose sight of the need to reform Section 18C, even despite the rejection of these changes recently by the Senate. But to make things even worse, the Labour Party now apparently wants to extend Section 18C, even to cover religious grounds, therefore creating a form of blasphemy law or Sharia law by stealth. Labour's Shadow Attorney General Mark Dreyfus has confirmed that Labour supports such changes to the Racial Discrimination Act because the opposition leader, Bill Shorten, rejects any changes to Section 18C. There appears to be a strategy not only to consolidate all the anti-discrimination laws, but to extend the controversial section to religious grounds, amongst other things. The proposal comes from Labour's MP, Anne Alley, and I must say that she is from Western Australia. Nobody's perfect. We have also bad politicians here. She's from here, and she's seeking to expand the scope of anti-discrimination laws to religion, while simultaneously imposing restrictions on free speech and religious freedom, further restrictions to religious freedom and free speech. The prospect of supporting such amendments emerged when Dr. Alley told that there was a scope to reassess extending Section 18C, arguing that the racism debate now extends to religion. She contends that such extension is necessary because, in her own opinion, we have definitely seen an increase in anti-Islamic rhetoric. I wonder why, by the way. So Dr. Alley's proposal has been strongly denounced by federal MP Tim Wilson, a former Human Rights Commissioner, and he argues that, in very strong terms, by the way, that such a proposal is part of a mad ideological drive of the Labour Party to use laws to shut up people. And it could turn Australia into Saudi Arabia, where people can be hauled before the courts for criticizing religion. Indeed, James Spiegelman has actually said so, because he says, and he once stated this, that the introduction of such law protecting religious people from strong criticism would have the practical effect of reintroducing the crime of blasphemy law in Australia. Dr. Alley's controversial proposal aims at applying to religion the same formulations which apply to race. But religion, contrary to race, is basically a matter of choice, not an immutable genetic characteristic. In contrast to racial issues, where one finds no matters of true and false, religious beliefs involve claims to truth and error. Religions make competing and often incompatible claims about the nature of the true God, the origins of the universe, the path to enlightenment, and how to live a good life, and so on. These sorts of claims are not mirrored in racial discourse. This is why it's correct to state that the laws of a democratic society should be less ready to protect people from vilification based on voluntary life choices of its citizens, as compared to unchangeable attributes of their birth. Indeed, the laws that make it illegal to voice a comment that may be regarded as offensive to any religious group inevitably compromise of freedom of political communication, a freedom derived from a system of representative government. And the High Court says that this is implied in a federal constitution. Otherwise, are we here in this country really willing to create in this country the crime of blasphemy that the Organization of the Islamic Conference is proposing? Naturally, radical Islamists living in our Western democracies have to find different ways to legally punish those who offend their beliefs. And you'll find in religious anti-discrimination laws a suitable mechanism to strike fear in the hearts of the enemies of the faith. Not surprising, Dr. Ali's ideas has obtained an enthusiastic support from the Federation of Islamic Council. The president of the Islamic Federation says this: of course we need protection. Section 18C should be strengthened and broadened so that Australians can go about their legitimate business free from persecution and on the basis of their religious affiliation. Well, what I have to say about that, so I'll interpret this statement here. Although it's not clear why such religious people should merit any form of statutory protection, even the slightest criticism of the most appalling beliefs might result in someone being dragged into court and accused of religious intolerance. This assumption was proven correct when one considers what took place in Victoria in the case of the Islamic Council of Victoria and Catch the Fire Ministries. An episode which illustrates the full potential for Islamic extremists to abuse these laws because they are reluctant to endure any criticism of their beliefs. Of course, they cannot go on here, doing something really illegal, but they can use the law for this purpose. So one of the things that I see that's happening is the creation, introduction, including with the support, the active support of the Labour Party, of what I have described as Sharia law by stealth. Australians must be entitled to manifest their opinion as to why they might regard any aspect of any belief as mendacious, as retrograde, and even, I would say, mindless. There is no apparent reason why speech in respect to religious matters should not simultaneously be characterized as a constitutionally valid exercise of freedom of speech, even in accordance with the implied freedom of political communication, because most of what we criticize about religion is about political matters. I couldn't care less what this guy is doing in a mosque or in a church, but if they come with statements that, for instance, I believe to violate human rights, or propose the violation of human rights, or if they oppose the idea of separation in of church and state, or if they oppose the rule of law, I have the right to speak out, and I should do so without fear. And what's happening with this kind of laws is that you get afraid about saying things. When I was interviewed a couple of years ago, a friend of mine interviewed me, and I said, do you really feel confident being a journalist to express your opinions freely? And he told me no. And I said, if you do not have this freedom, we do not live in a democracy. Because in a democracy, you should have freedom. We need to be able to express our ideas. Of course, the elite doesn't want us to express their ideas, and that's perhaps the reason as to why they try to shut the debate, because they want to impose their agenda. There is a hidden agenda behind the suppression of free speech. We need to fight for freedom, and freedom of speech is an essential element for a true democracy. Otherwise, what we have is rather an elected dictatorship. Thank you very much for this. Thank you.